Hey guys, what if I told you that just 150 years ago, in the very heart of what we consider civilization, people lived in conditions so harsh that a single day might test every fiber of your modern endurance? What if the fog that rolled through London's streets carried more than just mist, but the breath of a million souls struggling to survive? Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when the greatest city in the world harbored its darkest secrets in narrow alleys, where sunlight rarely touched the cobblestones. We'll walk softly through the forgotten rhythms of Victorian London's slums, where every dawn brought the same quiet desperation, and every sunset promised only the mercy of temporary rest. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. It's strangely comforting to see how many of us are drifting off together from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum, and let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. Close your eyes and imagine yourself stepping through time, past the grand facades and gaslit boulevards of Victorian prosperity, into the shadowed world that existed just beyond the reach of lamplight. Here, in these forgotten corners, millions lived lives of such quiet endurance that their very existence becomes a meditation on human resilience. The air grows thicker as we descend into memory. The sounds of our modern world fade away, placed by the distant echo of wooden wheels on cobblestone, the soft splash of water in puddles that never quite dry, and the endless rhythmic breathing of a city that never truly sleeps. Tonight, we'll experience what it meant to wake each morning in a world where comfort was a luxury beyond imagination, where a dry bed was a treasure, and where the simple act of surviving another day was, in itself, a quiet victory. Imagine yourself stirring in the gray hour before dawn, somewhere in the East End of London. In the year 1874, the first sensation isn't sight or sound, it's the dampness. It seeps through the thin mattress beneath you. A mattress you share with two strangers, whose names you've never learned, whose coughing has become the lullaby of your nights. Your eyes open slowly to a ceiling so low, you could touch it if you raised your arm, its wooden beams stained black with decades of soot and moisture. Water drips steadily from a crack above your head, each drop landing with a soft plip into a rusted tin pan someone placed there months ago. The sound has become so constant that silence would wake you faster than noise. The air you breathe is thick, not just with the fog that perpetually shrouds this part of London, but with the mingled sense of too many lives pressed too closely together. Coal smoke from 100 chimneys mixes with the sharp tang of lye soap, the sour sweetness of rotting vegetables, and underneath it all, the persistent earthiness of damp wool and unwashed bodies. Your stomach contracts with the familiar gnawing of hunger, not the gentle hunger of a delayed meal, but the deep, constant ache that has become your body's natural state. This hunger doesn't announce itself with gentle reminders. It settles into your bones like an old friend, patient and persistent, reminding you that food is not a given, but a daily challenge to be solved. As pale light begins to filter through the single grimy window of your lodging house room, you can make out the shapes around you. 3 mattresses are arranged on the floor, each supporting multiple forms. The woman beside you, Mrs. Patterson, you think her name is, breathes with the wet, rattling sound that speaks of consumption taking root in her lungs. Her youngest child, a boy of perhaps 6, sleeps curled against her side, his small hand unconsciously clutching a piece of bread crust that represents his security in this world. The walls around you weep with condensation, creating dark stains that bloom like strange flowers across the cracked plaster. In one corner, a wooden crate serves as both table and storage, holding the few possessions that define your entire material world. A chipped ceramic bowl, a bent spoon, a small piece of soap wrapped in brown paper, and a single change of undergarments that you wash when you can afford the soap and find the time. You rise slowly, your joints protesting the cold and the hardness of your sleeping place. The floorboards beneath your bare feet are warped and splintered, worn smooth in places by the passage of countless feet. Rough and dangerous in others, where nails work their way loose from the rotting wood. Each step must be considered, each movement careful, because even a small injury in this place can become something much worse. The day's first challenge presents itself immediately. Water. You join the queue that is already formed at the single pump that serves your building, and 3 others like it. The line stretches down the narrow alley, a patient procession of women and children. each carrying whatever vessel they could find to hold their daily ration of questionable liquid. The woman ahead of you holds a cracked earthenware jug that she cradles like a precious child. Behind you, a girl of perhaps 12 struggles with a bucket that seems too heavy for her thin arms. Her dress, if it can be called that, is a patchwork of different fabrics, each repair telling the story of another day survived, another small crisis overcome. The rhythm of the queue is meditative in its slowness. Step forward, wait. Step forward, wait. The pump itself is a temperamental creature, requiring a specific technique to coax water from its reluctant spout. Too gentle, and nothing emerges. Too forceful, and the handle breaks away from the mechanism entirely, leaving everyone to wait while someone searches for tools to repair it. When your turn finally arrives, the water that emerges is the color of weak tea, tinged brown with sediment and carrying a metallic taste that speaks of the pipes it has traveled through. But it is water, and in this place, water is life itself. You fill your vessel carefully, knowing that what you carry back up those narrow stairs must last until tomorrow brings you back to this same queue, in this same alley, for this same precious liquid. The building you call home is one of thousands like it, constructed not for comfort, but for the simple mathematics of survival. How many bodies can be housed in how small a space for how little money? Originally built as a single-family residence for someone of modest means, it has been subdivided and sub-subdivided until every closet, every corner, every space large enough for a human body to lie down has become someone's entire world. The stairs creak and sag under the weight of constant use. The banister, once polished wood, is now worn smooth and dark, with the touch of countless hands. In places, the wood is cracked entirely, leaving sharp edges that catch clothing and skin alike. The walls are stained with 1,000 different marks. Water damage, creating abstract patterns, soot from candles and oil lamps painting everything in shades of gray and brown, and here and there, the desperate scratches where someone has tried to mark their presence, their existence, their small claim to having been here at all. Your room, the room you share with whoever has the few pence required for a night's shelter, is perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet. In this space, 3 mattresses compete for floor space with a small table, a washstand that holds a cracked pitcher and basin, and a narrow wardrobe that serves the entire building. The ceiling slopes sharply under the eaves, creating spaces where only a child could stand upright, spaces that become storage for the few possessions that define entire lives. As the morning progresses, the building fills with the sounds of people preparing for the day's work, if work can be found. The rhythm of their preparation is different from anything you might know in our time. There is no rushing, no frantic energy, because energy is a resource too precious to waste on anything but the essential. Mrs. Patterson, despite her illness, will spend her day in piecework, sewing buttons onto cards hour after hour for payments measured in pence. Her fingers move with practiced efficiency, but you can see the effort each stitch costs her. The way she pauses occasionally to catch her breath, to steady herself against the waves of weakness that wash over her. The older children prepare for their own forms of labor. Some will head to the factories, where their small fingers can work the machinery that larger hands cannot reach. Others will take to the streets as crossing sweepers, clearing paths through the horse dung and mud for the boots of more fortunate citizens, hoping for the copper coins that might buy bread or milk. And you, what work awaits you in this economy of desperation? Perhaps you will join the crowd that gathers each morning at the docks, hoping that today the foreman's eye will fall upon you, that today you will be among the chosen few who will load and unload the ships that bring wealth to others, but offer you only the possibility of a day's wages. The small details of survival in this place create a tapestry of endurance that speaks to something profound about human adaptability. The way you learn to sleep despite the sounds, the crying of babies, the arguments of couples separated only by thin walls, the footsteps of strangers crossing the floor above your head, the way your body adjusts to cold that never quite goes away, to dampness that seems to settle into your bones like a permanent resident. You develop a sixth sense about your few possessions, knowing by touch alone whether everything you own is still in its place. You learn to eat slowly, not just to savor the rare experience of food, but because eating quickly can bring sickness when your stomach has grown unused to abundance of any kind. The rhythm of your days becomes a meditation on the most basic elements of existence: water, food, shelter, warmth, safety. Each of these simple words represents a complex daily negotiation with a world that offers no guarantees, no safety nets, no second chances. Your hands tell the story of this life. They are stained permanently with the dyes from whatever work you can find, marked with small scars from the sharp edges of survival, roughened by the constant handling of coarse materials and harsh soaps. Your fingernails are broken and black, not from choice but from necessity, from the kind of work that uses every part of your body as a tool. In this compressed world where privacy is a luxury no one can afford, you become part of an intricate social fabric woven from shared necessity. You know the sound of every footstep in your building, can identify your neighbors by their coughs, their sighs, the particular creak their bed makes when they turn over and sleep. There is an unspoken etiquette to this crowded existence. You learn when to acknowledge and when to ignore, when to offer help and when such an offer might be seen as pity. When Mrs. Patterson's coughing becomes particularly bad, someone always seems to appear with a cup of weak tea or a small piece of bread. No words are exchanged, no acknowledgement is expected, but the gesture flows as naturally as breathing. The children in these places develop a particular kind of wisdom. It's an understanding of adult concerns that sits strangely in their young faces. They learn to be quiet when quiet is needed, to make themselves small when space is at a premium, to find joy in the smallest things. A button that catches the light, a piece of string that can become a dozen different toys, a puddle that reflects the sky and makes the gray world seem suddenly larger. The smells of your world create their own calendar, their own clock. Morning brings the scent of coal smoke as fires are lit in those rooms fortunate enough to have hearths. The metallic temps of water from the communal pump. The yeasty smell of bread from the baker's cart that sometimes ventures into your neighborhood, though its goods remain largely beyond your reach. Midday carries the stronger sense of work and industry, the sharp chemical smell of the tanneries, the oily smoke from factories, the organic richness of horse dung from the streets. These scents mix with the more personal smells of cooking, usually cabbage or turnips, occasionally the luxury of bacon fat used to flavor whatever vegetables could be bought with the day's earnings. Evening brings its own aromatic signature. Gin palaces emit their sweet alcoholic breath into the streets. Candles and oil lamps create pools of sooty warmth. And always, underneath everything, the persistent dampness that is London itself. The city breathing its foggy breath into every corner, every crack, every space where humans try to make their homes. The sounds, too, create their own rhythm. The clatter of wooden wheels on cobblestones, the cry of street vendors hawking their wares. The distant whistle of trains carrying more fortunate passengers to destinations you can only imagine. Church bells that mark the hours for those who have the luxury of caring about time beyond the immediate needs of survival. In this world, you develop a different relationship with time itself. The future becomes a concept too dangerous to contemplate, too much uncertainty, too many variables beyond your control. The past becomes a luxury you cannot afford. Too much loss, too much regret, too many paths that led to this narrow alley, this cramped room, this daily struggle for the basic requirements of existence. Instead, you learn to live in the eternal present of survival. This moment, this breath, this step, when completed, brings you slightly closer to the end of another day. There is a strange peace in this compression of existence, a simplicity that strips away everything except what is absolutely essential. Your dreams, when they come, are modest by the standards of any other time or place. A dry bed, a full stomach. A day without the gnawing anxiety of not knowing where the next meal will come from. A room with a window that opens to something other than another building's wall. These dreams are not ambitious. They are revolutionary in their simple humanity. As darkness falls over your corner of London, you prepare for another night in the same bed, beside the same strangers, listening to the same sounds of a world that never quite sleeps. Tomorrow will bring the same challenges, the same small victories, the same quiet defeats. But it will also bring something else. Another day of existence. Another day of the strange. Persistent human miracle of continuing to be. You settle onto your portion of the mattress, arranging yourself carefully to avoid the springs that have worked their way through the thin fabric. Positioning yourself to catch the least amount of the water that will continue to drip from the crack in the ceiling above. Mrs. Patterson's coughing has quieted to a whisper, and somewhere in the building, someone is singing a soft, wordless melody that might be a lullaby or might simply be the sound of someone trying to comfort themselves in the gathering darkness. The fog presses against the window like a living thing, and you close your eyes knowing that in a few hours you will wake to begin this cycle again. But for now, for this moment, you have achieved the simple miracle of surviving another day in a world that offers no guarantees. Only the possibility that tomorrow might be slightly better, or at least no worse than today. The rhythm of the building settles around you, footsteps above, whispered conversations through thin walls, the soft sounds of other people arranging themselves for sleep. And slowly, gradually, you drift into dreams where the mattress is dry, the air is warm, and somewhere in the distance, morning is still hours away. As the morning light strengthens over the slums we've just explored, let us drift our attention to another figure moving through these same streets. A man whose footsteps echo differently on the cobblestones, whose clothes mark him as a visitor from another world entirely. Henry Mayhew walks among the costermongers and crossing sweepers with the careful gait of someone who knows he doesn't belong, yet feels compelled to witness what others would prefer to ignore. Born into comfort in 1812, Mayhew carried within him a curiosity that would prove both blessing and burden. The son of a lawyer, educated and articulate, he might have spent his life in the drawing rooms of respectability, writing humorous sketches for magazines and enjoying the pleasures of London's literary society. Indeed, he helped found Punch magazine, that gentle, satirical voice of Victorian wit. But something in his nature pulled him away from the gaslit world of middle-class certainty and into the shadows where most of his contemporaries feared to tread. The London of Mayhew's childhood had been one of clear boundaries and comfortable assumptions. The wealthy lived in their squares and crescents, the poor remained largely invisible, and the middle classes occupied themselves with the pleasant fiction that society functioned according to some natural order, that rewarded virtue and punished vice. Young Henry had been raised on these certainties, educated in schools where the poor were discussed as abstractions, problems of political economy rather than human beings with individual stories, dreams, and sufferings. But something in his temperament resisted these comfortable simplicities. Perhaps it was the journalist's instinct that drove him to look beneath surfaces. Or perhaps it was a deeper spiritual restlessness that found the prescribed satisfactions of his class insufficient. Whatever the source, Mayhew began to feel an almost physical pull toward the very areas of London that his upbringing had taught him to avoid. His early forays into social observation began almost accidentally, writing comic pieces for various publications. He would wander through London's streets seeking material, and gradually his attention was captured not by the absurdities of the fashionable classes, but by the extraordinary resilience and ingenuity of those struggling to survive at society's margins. What had begun as a search for humorous anecdotes slowly transformed into something approaching a calling. Picture him now in the early 1850s, descending from the comfort of his cab at the edge of the East End, notebook in hand, his well-tailored coat marking him immediately as an outsider. His approach to documenting the lives of London's poor was revolutionary in its simplicity. He listened. Where others might have imposed their own interpretations, their own moral judgments, Mayhew simply asked people to tell him their stories, and then he wrote down their words with an almost religious devotion to accuracy. The very act of listening had become an art form for Mayhew. He had learned to modulate his voice, to soften his educated accent just enough to put people at ease without seeming to condescend. He had developed an instinct for when to ask follow-up questions and when to let silence do the work of invitation. Most importantly, he had trained himself to hear not just the surface content of what people told him, but the rhythms and cadences that revealed character, the small details that illuminated larger truths about how life was actually lived at the bottom of society's ladder. His notebooks became repositories of voices that seemed to emerge from the fog itself. Each interview was preceded by careful observation, the way a person held their body, the condition of their clothes, the particular geography of whatever corner they had claimed as their workspace. Mayhew understood that context mattered enormously, that the same words might carry different weights depending on whether they were spoken in a warm parlor or on a freezing street corner. The rhythm of his work became a meditation in itself. Day after day, he would walk the same streets we've just imagined, but with eyes trained to see not just the struggle, but the individual humanity within that struggle. He would stop beside a mudlark, one of those children who scavenged the Thames edge for anything that might be sold. And instead of seeing just poverty, he would see a particular child with a particular story, a unique voice that deserved to be preserved. One such child told him in words that Mayhew recorded with gentle precision about the cold that seemed to live in the river mud, how it would climb up through his bare feet and settle in his bones, until he felt he might never be warm again. The boy spoke of finding a penny one morning, buried in the silt near London Bridge, and how that single coin had felt like a miracle. The river itself had offered him a gift. But the child also described the elaborate mental geography he had created of the Thames shore, which spots yielded the most promising debris, which tides brought the richest pickings, which stretches of riverbank were claimed by older, stronger scavengers, who would drive him away with threats or blows. Mayhew wrote down every word, preserving not just the fact of poverty, but the poetry that emerged from within it. He captured the boy's description of how different types of mud felt under his fingers. The sticky clay that clung and made walking difficult, the sandy patches where small objects could be buried just beneath the surface, the treacherous spots where the river bottom dropped away suddenly, creating pools that could swallow a careless child. The mudlark's story revealed layers of knowledge that any university-educated gentleman might envy. The boy could read the Thames like a vast book, interpreting the meaning of debris patterns, predicting where the tide would deposit its treasures, understanding the complex relationships between weather, river flow, and the likelihood of profitable scavenging. He knew which docks dumped what kinds of refuse, which ships were careless with their cargo, which times of day offered the best opportunities and the least competition. His notebooks filled with voices that might otherwise have vanished into the fog forever. Crossing sweeper named Jack, perhaps 14 years old, would learn to read the moods of gentlemen by the sound of their footsteps on wet pavement. When the steps were quick and sharp, he knew to move swiftly, clearing the path with urgent sweeps of his worn broom. When the steps were slow and deliberate, he could take his time, perhaps even venture a respectful "Good morning, sir," which might result in a copper coin pressed into his palm. Jack's story unfolded like a masterclass in urban survival. He had claimed a particular corner where 3 streets met, a spot that provided steady foot traffic without being so desirable that older boys would fight him for it. He had learned to recognize regular pedestrians, understanding which ones might be approachable for conversation and which preferred to pass in silence. He could identify clerks by their ink-stained fingers, merchants by the particular way they checked their pocket watches, gentlemen of leisure by their unhurried pace and expensive walking sticks. The crossing sweeper had developed an almost scientific understanding of weather patterns and their effect on his trade. Rain meant more mud, which meant more work, but also more opportunity. Gentlemen were more likely to tip generously when their path was kept truly clean. Snow created different challenges, requiring different techniques and offering different rewards. Fog meant that people moved more carefully, more gratefully, when someone helped guide them safely across treacherous intersections. There was something almost mystical about the way Mayhew worked, moving through the slums like a confessor, inviting people to unburden themselves of stories they had never been asked to tell. A woman who sold watercress from a basket told him about the mathematics of survival. She needed to sell 40 bunches to earn enough for a room for the night. How she had learned to arrange the green leaves so that even the wilted ones looked fresh in the morning light. How the cold made her hands shake. But she had to hold them steady because dropping the cress meant losing the day's profit. The watercress seller's narrative revealed the intricate calculations that governed every moment of her day. She had to rise before dawn to reach Covent Garden Market early enough to get the freshest cress at the best prices. The walk from the market to her selling spot required careful planning, which routes were shortest, which streets had fewer competitors, which corners offered the best visibility to potential customers. She had memorized the schedules of nearby factories and offices, knowing exactly when workers would emerge with a few spare pennies for fresh greens. Her story included the elaborate strategies she had developed for preserving her merchandise. Bundles were wrapped in damp cloths to keep them fresh, arranged in her basket according to a system that maximized visual appeal while minimizing handling damage. She had learned to read the faces of potential customers, identifying those who might be persuaded to buy and those who would only waste her time. Her voice carried the particular cadences of her sales calls, the practiced enthusiasm that could make even wilted watercress sound appealing. The gentle persistence of his questioning revealed layers of existence that more hurried observers would have missed. He discovered that even within the deepest poverty, there were hierarchies, distinctions that mattered enormously to those who lived them. The mudlarks looked down upon the purefinders, who collected dog dung to sell to tanneries. The costermongers, who sold fruit and vegetables from wheeled carts, considered themselves a step above those who had no cart, who had to carry their wares in baskets. These distinctions, invisible to the comfortable classes, created a complex social structure within the world of want. Mayhew's careful documentation revealed that these hierarchies were based on subtle but crucial differences in income, stability, and social position. A costermonger with a proper cart and regular pitch enjoyed a kind of respect that was denied to someone who sold matches from a tray. The possession of tools, a cart, a regular selling spot, established relationships with suppliers, created gradations of status that were fiercely defended and deeply meaningful to those who had so little else to claim as their own. The purefinders, who occupied the bottom of this hierarchy, told Mayhew stories that revealed the extraordinary resourcefulness required to survive in work that others found too degrading even to acknowledge. They had developed specialized knowledge about which neighborhoods produced the most valuable waste, which types of dung commanded the highest prices from tanneries, which times of day offered the best opportunities for collection. Their work required physical strength, detailed knowledge of the city's geography, and the psychological resilience to find dignity in labor that society regarded as beneath consideration. Mayhew's approach was revolutionary because he refused to sentimentalize or sensationalize. When a bone picker, one of those who sorted through refuse heaps, looking for anything that could be sold or recycled, described his work, Mayhew recorded not just the horror of the conditions, but the man's quiet pride in his ability to support his family through this labor, his deep knowledge of what bones were worth most, his satisfaction in finding something valuable that others had discarded. The bone picker's expertise was vast and precise. He could identify different types of bones by touch and darkness, knew which would be purchased by glue manufacturers and which by fertilizer makers. He understood the economic cycles that governed his trade, how demand fluctuated with the seasons, which times of year brought the best prices, how to negotiate with the various dealers who purchased his findings. His work required strength to move heavy sacks of bones, intelligence to sort and categorize his merchandise, and the social skills necessary to maintain relationships with suppliers and buyers. His narrative included the elaborate geography of refuse that mapped onto London's official geography. He knew which neighborhoods produced the most promising waste, which restaurants and butcher shops were most careless with valuable discards, which collection routes were most efficient. His knowledge extended to the legal and quasi-legal aspects of his trade, which property owners tolerated scavenging and which would call for police intervention, which times of day offered the best opportunities for work without interference. The rhythm of these interviews created their own kind of music, question and answer, story and response, the gentle prompting that allowed voices to emerge that had been silent for so long. Mayhew had learned that the poor, like everyone else, wanted their stories to matter, wanted someone to understand that their lives contained love and hope and small triumphs alongside the more obvious struggles. His technique involved a careful balance of interest and restraint. He asked enough questions to draw out detail and context, but not so many as to make his subjects feel interrogated or judged. He had learned to recognize when someone was ready to share more personal information, and when they needed to remain at the level of practical description. His presence seemed to give people permission to articulate experiences they had never been invited to share, to find language for struggles that had previously remained private and wordless. A woman who took in washing told him about the joy she felt when she could afford to buy her children a penny's worth of treacle, how their faces would transform with delight as they dipped bread into the dark sweetness. She described the elaborate ritual she had created around this rare treat, how she would make it last as long as possible, how the memory of their smiles could sustain her through days of bent-back labor over tubs of scalding water and harsh soap. The washerwoman's story revealed the intricate, emotional economy that made survival possible under the harshest circumstances. She had learned to find meaning and satisfaction in the smallest pleasures, to create ceremonies of celebration around experiences that more fortunate people would hardly notice. The penny's worth of treacle became a focal point for family joy, a shared experience that created memories powerful enough to sustain hope through weeks of deprivation. Her narrative included detailed descriptions of the physical demands of her work, the particular ache that developed in her lower back from bending over wash tubs, the way harsh soap and constant moisture cracked and reddened her hands, the steam and heat that made her work environment nearly unbearable in summer. But she also described the satisfaction of transforming filthy clothes into clean ones, the pride she took in her reputation for thoroughness, the small social connections she maintained with other women who brought her their washing. Through Mayhew's careful documentation, we begin to understand that survival in the slums required not just physical endurance, but extraordinary creativity and resilience. He recorded the ingenious ways people found to make money. Children who learned to sing popular songs in pub courtyards, women who braided their hair into switches that could be sold to wig makers, men who collected cigar ends from the streets and processed them into new tobacco products. The street singers that Mayhew interviewed revealed the sophisticated performance skills required to succeed in this precarious profession. Children had to learn not just the words and melodies of popular songs, but how to read audiences, how to position themselves for maximum impact, how to time their performances to coincide with moments when potential donors might be most generous. They developed repertoires that could be adjusted to different venues and audiences, sentimental ballads for family gatherings, patriotic songs for political meetings, comic numbers for public houses. The hair trade that employed women in the slums involved complex negotiations between vanity, necessity, and commerce. Women learned to assess the value of their hair, understanding which lengths and colors commanded the highest prices, which times of year brought the best market conditions. The process of selling one's hair involved not just the economic transaction, but the psychological adjustment to a dramatically altered appearance, the social implications of being seen as someone who had sold part of herself for money. His notebooks reveal the intricate networks of mutual aid that kept communities functioning despite the absence of any official support. He wrote about lodging housekeepers who would extend credit to regular tenants who fell short of the nightly fee, about costermongers who would share their pitches with newcomers to the trade, about the informal systems of childcare that allowed mothers to work while knowing their children were being watched by neighbors who understood the fragility of their circumstances. These networks of mutual aid represented sophisticated social systems that operated according to their own rules and obligations. Mayhew documented how favors were extended and repaid, how trust was established and maintained, how conflicts were resolved without recourse to official authorities who might be unsympathetic or hostile. The lodging housekeepers who extended credit did so according to careful calculations about reliability and risk, creating informal banking systems that served people who had no access to legitimate financial institutions. The shared childcare arrangements that Mayhew observed revealed communities where children belonged, not just to their parents, but to networks of women who understood that survival required cooperation. These arrangements allowed mothers to work longer hours or take opportunities that might otherwise be impossible, while ensuring that children were supervised and, when possible, fed. The women who participated in these networks developed complex systems of reciprocity that balanced immediate need against long-term relationship maintenance. The work took a toll on Mayhew himself. His comfortable contemporaries often found his dedication to documenting poverty somewhat unseemly, as if prolonged exposure to such conditions might be contagious. He began to move between two worlds, the literary salons where his humor and wit were celebrated, and the narrow alleys where he sat patiently listening to stories that few people wanted to hear. The psychological strain of this double life became evident in Mayhew's personal correspondence and in the observations of friends who noticed changes in his demeanor and preoccupations. The comfortable assumptions of his own class began to feel increasingly hollow and artificial when measured against the realities he was documenting. Dinner party conversations about literature and politics seemed frivolous when he had spent the day listening to accounts of children working 16-hour days in dangerous conditions or families choosing between rent and food. The social consequences of his work extended beyond personal discomfort. Some of his literary acquaintances began to avoid him, finding his conversation uncomfortably focused on subjects they preferred not to contemplate. Others treated him as an eccentric whose obsession with the poor is a kind of intellectual hobby rather than serious social investigation. The middle-class reformers, who might have been natural allies, often found his approach too sympathetic to individual voices and not sufficiently focused on systematic solutions. But perhaps this tension was exactly what made his work so powerful. He never lost his sense of the enormous gulf between the worlds he inhabited, never became so accustomed to poverty that he ceased to be moved by it. Each interview retained its capacity to surprise him, to reveal new depths of human adaptability and dignity in circumstances that might have crushed the spirit of someone with fewer resources. This preservation of emotional responsiveness required constant effort on Mayhew's part. He had to resist both the numbing that might come from repeated exposure to suffering and the opposite danger of becoming so overwhelmed by individual stories that he lost the ability to function effectively as a documenter and witness. His notebooks reveal someone struggling to maintain the delicate balance between empathy and objectivity that allowed him to continue his work over years. His writing itself began to reflect this duality. The same man who could craft elegant comic verse for Punch could also capture the cadences of street speech with perfect accuracy, preserving not just the content of what people told him, but the rhythms and patterns that made each voice unique. Reading his transcriptions today, more than a century and a half later, we can still hear the particular intonation of a costermonger calling his wares, the careful politeness of a crossing sweeper addressing a potential customer, the weary resignation of a woman calculating whether she has enough coins for bread or must go hungry another night. The technical aspects of his transcription work reveal the extraordinary care Mayhew took to preserve authentic voices. He developed a system of notation that captured not just words, but tone, pace, and emphasis. He recorded regional accents, occupational jargon, and the particular vocabularies that had developed within different trades and communities. His interviews often included multiple visits to the same person, allowing him to verify details and capture the full complexity of individual stories. The literary techniques he employed to present these voices required innovations that no precedent in the journalism of his era. He had to find ways to let people speak in their own words, while providing enough context for middle-class readers to understand the circumstances being described. His solutions involved careful framing that respected the integrity of individual voices, while making them accessible to audiences who had no direct experience of the conditions being documented. As we drift alongside Mayhew through these streets, we begin to understand that his greatest achievement was not just documentation, but translation. He found a way to make the invisible visible, to transform the anonymous masses of the poor into individuals with names, histories, hopes, and fears. His pen became a bridge between worlds that normally never acknowledged each other's existence. The metaphor of translation captures something essential about Mayhew's work that goes beyond simple recording. He was translating not just between different social classes, but between different ways of understanding human value and dignity. The middle-class readers of his work were accustomed to thinking about the poor in categories: the deserving and undeserving, the industrious and the lazy, the moral and the immoral. Mayhew's individual portraits complicated these categories by revealing the particular circumstances and choices that shaped each life. His translation work also involved finding language that could capture experiences for which middle-class vocabulary was inadequate. How do you describe the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from chronic malnutrition to people who have never missed a meal? How do you convey the psychological impact of constant uncertainty about basic shelter to people who take their homes for granted? Mayhew's solution was to let his subjects find their own language for these experiences, then provide enough context for readers to understand the broader implications. The fog that perpetually shrouded the East End seemed to part slightly from Mayhew, revealing glimpses of lives lived with such quiet heroism that they demanded witness. And in witnessing, in recording, in preserving these voices for future generations, he performed an act of profound respect for human dignity that transcends the particular circumstances of Victorian London. The metaphor of the fog parting suggests that Mayhew's work had an almost spiritual dimension, that his patient attention and careful listening created moments of clarity and connection that cut through the obscurity that normally separated different social worlds. His subjects seemed to sense that they were being truly seen and heard, perhaps for the first time in their lives, and they responded by sharing not just the surface facts of their existence, but the deeper truths about how they understood their own lives and circumstances. Tonight, as we listen to these voices echoing across the years, we are participating in the continuation of Mayhew's work. We are choosing to see, to listen, to remember those whose struggles might otherwise vanish into the anonymity of historical statistics. In the gentle rhythm of his questioning and their answering, we find a meditation on what it means to truly see another human being, to honor their experience, and to preserve their story as part of the larger human narrative. Let us now drift deeper into the mysteries that shrouded Victorian London, literally and figuratively. As evening approaches in our journey through time, the fog begins to thicken, transforming the narrow alleys and cramped tenements into something approaching the ethereal. This fog was no mere weather phenomenon, but a living presence that shaped the very character of the city and the lives of those who dwelt within its embrace. The London fog of the 1870s was a creature born of human industry and natural circumstance, a marriage between the Thames, ancient mists, and the endless exhalation of coal smoke from a million chimneys. It rolled through the streets like slow water, thick enough to touch, dense enough to muffle sound and transform familiar landmarks into ghostly suggestions of themselves. In the slums, where buildings pressed close together and streets ran narrow and crooked, the fog became an additional inhabitant, as much a part of daily life as hunger or cold. The very composition of this fog defied easy description. Unlike the clean morning mists that rose from rivers in the countryside, London's fog carried within its gray embrace the detritus of urban civilization. Coal smoke from countless hearths mingled with industrial emissions from factories and gasworks, creating a mixture that was part vapor, part suspended particulate matter. The fog had weight and substance. It could be felt on the skin, tasted in the mouth, smelled in its complex cocktail of burning coal, industrial chemicals, and organic decay. The fog's daily rhythm became as predictable as the tides. It would begin to form in the early morning hours as the first fires were lit, thickening throughout the day as more and more chimneys added their contributions to the gray blanket that settled over the city. By evening, it could be so dense that gas lamps became mere points of light in an otherwise impenetrable gray world, their illumination extending only a few feet before being swallowed by the murky air. Those who lived in this perpetual twilight developed senses that we can barely imagine. They learned to navigate by touch and sound, their fingers trailing along familiar walls, their ears attuned to the particular echo that meant an alley was widening into a courtyard or narrowing toward a dead end. The fog created its own geography, its own rules of movement and survival. The development of these enhanced senses was not merely adaptation, but a form of education that began in early childhood. Children born into the fog-wrapped world of the slums learned to read the city through their fingertips before they ever saw it clearly. They could distinguish between the smooth stone of a church wall and the rough brick of a tenement, between the iron railings that marked a gentleman's residence and the wooden barriers that surrounded a factory. Their fingers learned to interpret the urban landscape as accurately as a rural child might read the textures of forest and field. The acoustic landscape of fog-wrapped London was equally complex and informative. The gray atmosphere muffled some sounds while amplifying others in unexpected ways. Footsteps took on different qualities depending on the surface they struck and the density of the fog that surrounded them. The clip-clop of horses' hooves could indicate not just the approach of traffic, but the social status of the rider, the measured pace of a gentleman's carriage versus the urgent clatter of a delivery wagon versus the careful steps of a working horse pulling an overloaded cart. Voices, too, carried differently in the fog. Conversations that would be clearly audible on a clear day became disembodied whispers that seemed to float without direction. Street vendors learned to modify their calls, developing techniques for projecting their voices through the gray atmosphere. The cry of fresh milk or hot pies had to be calibrated not just for volume, but for the particular acoustic properties of fog-wrapped air. Children born into this gray world knew the city through their fingertips before they ever saw it clearly. They could identify different neighborhoods by smell alone, the metallic temps of the foundries, the organic richness of the markets, the sharp chemical bite of the gasworks. The fog carried these scents like messages, creating an olfactory map that guided those who had learned to read its subtle variations. The neighborhood signatures carried by the fog were remarkably precise and reliable. The area around the breweries carried the sweet, yeasty smell of fermenting grain that could be detected from streets away. Near the tanneries, the fog brought the sharp, acrid odor of chemicals used in leather processing, mixed with the organic smells of animal hides. The docks contributed their own complex bouquet, tar and rope, exotic spices from distant lands. The salt smell of river water, and the particular mixture of coal smoke and steam that marked the presence of the new railway terminals. Each trade and industry added its own notes to this olfactory symphony. The soap factories contributed an alkaline sharpness that made the air seem to burn slightly in the nostrils. The gasworks released their distinctive chemical signature that warned of their proximity long before their structures became visible. Even residential areas had their own smells. The poorer neighborhoods marked by the odors of too many people living in too small spaces. The smell of inadequate sanitation mixing with coal smoke and cooking odors, while more prosperous areas carried the subtle sense of better heating, cleaner clothes, and more varied cooking. But the fog held secrets deeper than navigation. In its gray embrace, the rigid social boundaries of Victorian society became blurred, sometimes literally invisible. A gentleman might brush past a crossing sweeper without either seeing the other clearly, their separate worlds touching briefly in the democratic blindness of the mist. Stories circulated of people becoming lost just streets from their homes, of the familiar becoming suddenly foreign when wrapped in gray cotton. These moments of accidental encounter across class lines created their own folklore within the city. Tales were told of wealthy gentlemen who had been guided to safety by street children they would never have acknowledged in clear weather. Of ladies who had accepted help from working women they would normally have passed without recognition. The fog created temporary suspensions of the social order. Moments when necessity overcame propriety, and strangers became allies in the shared challenge of navigation. The disorientation that fog brought to familiar spaces had profound psychological effects. People reported feeling lost in neighborhoods they had known since childhood, transformed by the gray atmosphere into alien landscapes. The usual landmarks, church spires, prominent buildings, familiar shop fronts, disappeared into the murk, leaving even longtime residents dependent on more primitive forms of navigation. This regular disorientation created a peculiar form of urban vertigo, a reminder that the city they thought they knew was only the visible layer of a more complex and mysterious reality. The superstitions that flourished in the slums often centered around the fog itself. Some believed it carried messages from the dead, voices of those who had perished in the cholera outbreaks or the endless grinding poverty, their spirits unable to find rest in the gray between world where day and night lost their meaning. Others saw it as a protective blanket, hiding their struggles from the judgment of the comfortable classes, allowing them to move through their difficult lives with a measure of privacy. The spiritual interpretations of the fog varied widely among different communities within the slums. Irish immigrants brought their own folklore about mists and spirits, seeing in London's fog echoes of the supernatural traditions they had known in their homeland. They spoke of the fog as a place where the boundary between the living and the dead became permeable, where the voices of lost relatives might be heard whispering in the gray air. Some claimed to see figures moving through the mist that appeared to be people they had known, only to discover upon closer approach that no one was there. Other communities developed entirely different relationships with the fog. Some saw it as a manifestation of divine displeasure with the moral condition of the city, a visible sign of the corruption and inequality that marked urban life. Religious street preachers incorporated the fog into their sermons, using its omnipresence as a metaphor for spiritual blindness, its suffocating quality as an image of sin's effect on the soul. In the lodging houses, people would gather around small fires when coal could be afforded, telling stories that seemed to emerge from the fog itself. Tales of phantom hansom cabs that appeared from nowhere to carry away the dying, of mysterious benefactors who left coins on windowsills before vanishing back into the mist, of children who claimed to have seen through the fog to other versions of London. Cleaner, warmer, more generous versions where the same streets held different possibilities. These storytelling sessions became essential community rituals, creating shared narratives that helped make sense of the disorienting and often frightening experience of life in the fog-wrapped slums. The stories served multiple functions: entertainment during long, cold evenings, but also a form of collective dreaming that allowed people to imagine alternatives to their current circumstances. The phantom cabs might represent hope for miraculous rescue, the mysterious benefactors a belief that help might come from unexpected sources. The alternative London's a way of maintaining faith that change was possible. The stories also served as informal systems of information sharing, tales of certain streets to avoid, of new sources of work or assistance, of changes in law enforcement patterns were often embedded within supernatural narratives that made them more memorable and easier to transmit. A story about ghostly figures seen in a particular alley might actually be a way of warning about criminal activity, while tales of benevolent spirits might encode information about charitable organizations or sympathetic individuals. The gin palaces that dotted the slum neighborhoods became islands of gaslight warmth in this gray sea, of brass fittings and mirrored walls. Created pockets of brilliance that seemed to push back against the perpetual twilight outside. The contrast was so stark that stepping from the fog into one of these establishments felt like entering another world entirely. A world of light and heat and momentary forgetfulness, where the gray weight of daily struggle could be temporarily lifted. The architectural design of these gin palaces was specifically calculated to create maximum contrast with the gray world outside. The proprietors understood that they were selling not just alcohol, but a temporary escape from the fog-wrapped reality of slum life. The gas jets were arranged to create the greatest possible amount of light. The mirrors positioned to multiply and reflect that light throughout the interior spaces. The brass fittings were polished to a shine that caught and threw back every ray of illumination, creating environments that seemed to pulse with warmth and life. The social dynamics within these brightly lit spaces took on their own character. The sudden transition from the isolating fog to the crowded, well-lit interior created a particular kind of intimacy among strangers. People who might have passed each other invisibly in the gray streets outside found themselves in sudden proximity, sharing warmth and light in ways that encouraged temporary camaraderie. The fog became a topic of conversation that transcended class and occupational differences. Everyone who entered had battled the same gray atmosphere to reach this island of brightness. Archaeological excavations in modern London continue to unearth the material remnants of this fog-wrapped world. In old cesspits and building foundations, archaeologists find the small objects that tell the intimate stories of slum life. Clay pipes, their bowls worn smooth by anxious fingers, speak of brief moments of comfort stolen from days of endless labor. Broken pottery, carefully mended with wire or glue, reveals the precious nature of every possession, the way broken things were coaxed back into usefulness rather than discarded. The archaeological record of Victorian London reveals the extraordinary ingenuity that characterized material life in the slums. Objects that might have been discarded without thought in wealthier households were repaired, repurposed, and reused until they literally fell apart. Pottery shards show evidence of multiple repairs, suggesting vessels that continued to serve their owners long after their structural integrity had been severely compromised. Metal objects reveal similar histories of repeated repair and modification, adapted for new purposes as their original functions became impossible to maintain. The clay pipes found in archaeological excavations tell particularly poignant stories. Many show patterns that suggest they were shared among multiple users, passed from hand to hand in lodging houses where even the small comfort of tobacco had to be communal. Bear evidence of repeated repairs, tiny holes plugged with wax or other materials. To extend the life of an object that might have cost a precious halfpenny, the pipes become artifacts of community and survival, evidence of the social bonds that made life possible under the harshest circumstances. The bones found in these excavations tell their own stories, not the dramatic bones of violence or catastrophe, but the quiet bones of malnutrition and overwork, of lives lived at the very edge of survival. Archaeologists can read in these remains the evidence of childhood hunger, of backs bent too early under the weight of adult labor, of the subtle violence that poverty inflicted on human bodies over decades of endurance. The osteological evidence from Victorian London's poor neighborhoods provides scientific confirmation of the living conditions that Mayhew and others documented in their social investigations. Skeletal remains show clear signs of nutritional deficiencies that began in early childhood and continued throughout life. Growth patterns reveal periods of severe malnutrition that stunted development, while bone density studies indicate the effects of inadequate calcium and protein intake over many years. The wear patterns on bones tell stories of occupational stress that began in childhood and intensified throughout working life. Spinal columns show the characteristic changes associated with carrying heavy loads from an early age. while joint deterioration indicates repetitive motions that continued long past the point where they caused pain and disability. These physical remains provide mute testimony to the human cost of industrial development and urban poverty. But perhaps the most poignant discoveries are the toys. Roughly carved wooden dolls, marbles made from clay, intricate constructions built from scraps of wire and fabric. These objects speak to something indestructible in the human spirit, the way joy and creativity persist even in the harshest circumstances. A child's doll, sewn from rags and stuffed with straw, becomes a testament to the power of imagination to transform the most meager materials into sources of comfort and delight. The children's toys recovered from archaeological sites reveal the extraordinary resourcefulness that characterized family life in the slums. Parents and children created playthings from materials that wealthier families would have discarded without thought. Buttons became wheels for tiny carriages. Scraps of fabric were transformed into elaborate dolls' wardrobes. Broken pottery was ground smooth to create marbles and gaming pieces. These toys required not just material creativity, but imaginative investment. The ability to see possibilities for joy and play within circumstances that offered little of either. The construction techniques evident in these recovered toys demonstrate sophisticated understanding of materials and engineering principles. Wooden dolls show evidence of careful carving and joining, revealing skills that might have been applied to more profitable trades if opportunities had existed. Wire sculptures display an understanding of balance and structure that suggests artistic talent being expressed through whatever materials were available. Even the simplest toys, cornhusk dolls, rag balls, carved wooden animals, show attention to detail and proportion that speaks to the human need for beauty and craftsmanship. Regardless of economic circumstances, the streets themselves have become archaeological sites. Their layers of cobblestone and paving, telling the story of a city constantly rebuilding itself over its own past. Beneath the modern surfaces lie the old storm drains and sewers, the forgotten cellars and abandoned foundations where families once struggled to survive. Urban archaeologists speak of the palimpsest effect, the way London has been written and rewritten over itself. Each generation adding new layers while traces of the old remain visible to those who know how to look. The archaeological investigation of London's Victorian infrastructure reveals the complex relationship between the visible city and the hidden networks that made urban life possible. The sewers and storm drains that ran beneath the slum. Neighborhoods tell stories of engineering innovation mixed with public health disaster. Early drainage systems were often inadequate for the populations they served, creating conditions that contributed to the cholera outbreaks and other diseases that regularly swept through the poorest areas. The cellars and sub-basements that honeycomb the ground beneath modern London provide evidence of the vertical expansion of poverty during the Victorian era. As population pressure increased and available housing decreased, families moved into spaces that had never been intended for human habitation. Archaeological evidence reveals cellars that were subdivided and re-subdivided, with thin walls creating tiny rooms that housed entire families. The material remains found in these spaces, cooking implements, personal belongings, children's toys, provide intimate glimpses into lives lived largely underground, away from natural light and adequate ventilation. In the Thames, mudlarks still work the shore as much as their Victorian predecessors did, though now they search for historical artifacts rather than daily survival. The objects they find, buttons, coins, personal ornaments, tools, create a material timeline of life in the slums. A pewter button from a child's coat, a bent spoon, polished smooth by countless meals. A small religious medal worn as protection against the diseases that haunted the overcrowded neighborhoods. Each object is a frozen moment, a connection across time to hands that once held these same items with purpose and care. The modern mudlarks, who search the Thames shores, have developed their own expertise in reading the river's archaeological deposits. They understand how tidal patterns affect the distribution of artifacts, which sections of riverbank are most likely to yield interesting finds, how to distinguish genuinely historical objects from more recent debris. Their work continues the tradition of Thames scavenging while transforming it into a form of historical research that helps illuminate the daily life of London's poor. The objects recovered from the Thames mud provide remarkably intimate insights into Victorian daily life. Personal ornaments, lockets, rings, decorative pins, suggests that even the poorest people found ways to own and display objects of beauty and sentimental value. Children's toys and gaming pieces indicate that play and leisure existed even within the harshest circumstances. Religious medals and other devotional objects reveal the spiritual life of communities that are often portrayed only in terms of their material deprivation. The mystery of how so many people simply vanished into the fog, literally and metaphorically, continues to haunt historians. The informal nature of slum life meant that many residents left no official trace of their existence. They appeared in no census, owned no property, entered into no legal contracts. Their presence in the world was recorded only in the memories of neighbors. In the worn grooves their footsteps left in wooden stairs, in the faint impressions their bodies made in shared mattresses. The problem of invisible populations in Victorian London extends beyond simple record-keeping failures to fundamental questions about how society chooses to see and acknowledge different groups of people. The official mechanisms of documentation, census records, birth and death certificates, employment records, were designed around assumptions about stable residence, legitimate employment, and participation in official institutions. People whose lives fell outside these assumptions could exist for years without leaving any trace in the historical record. This invisibility was often a matter of survival as much as oversight. Many slum residents had reasons to avoid official attention. They might be in debt, fleeing domestic violence, avoiding military service, or engaged in work that was quasi-legal or entirely illegal. The fog became both a literal and metaphorical cover that allowed people to disappear into the gray spaces between official recognition and complete invisibility. This absence of official documentation has created gaps in the historical record that archaeologists and historians are still trying to fill. Sometimes a cache of letters is discovered in the walls of a demolished building, or a collection of photographs turns up in an old trunk, suddenly illuminating lives that had been invisible to history. These discoveries feel almost magical, as if the fog is occasionally willing to part and reveal glimpses of the lives it once concealed. The accidental preservation of personal documents provides some of the most moving insights into lives that otherwise left no trace. Letters tucked into walls during building renovations, photographs hidden in false bottoms of trunks, diary pages used as stuffing for cushions. These chance survivals offer windows into the emotional and intellectual life of people who were never considered worth documenting by their contemporaries. Recent discoveries have included love letters written by a young woman working in a match factory to a sailor whose ship was lost at sea. Not just personal tragedy, but the broader networks of affection and obligation that connected working-class communities across great distances. A cache of children's school exercises found in the foundation of a demolished tenement showed the extraordinary efforts that some families made to provide education for their children, despite overwhelming economic pressure. These documents humanize populations that are often reduced to statistics and historical accounts. The cultural practices that developed in the fog-shrouded slums often centered around sound rather than sight. Music became especially important, not just for entertainment, but as a way of maintaining community connections. When visual contact was limited, the evening singing that emerged from lodging houses and tenements created an invisible network of shared humanity, voices calling to voices across the gray divide. The role of music in fog-wrapped London took on dimensions that would be difficult to imagine in our visually oriented world. When people could not see each other clearly, voices became the primary means of establishing and maintaining social connections. Singing served multiple functions. It provided entertainment during long, dark evenings. But it also served as a way of communicating location and identity across distances that fog made impossible to navigate visually. Different neighborhoods and communities developed their own musical signatures. Irish immigrants brought traditional ballads and dance tunes that identified their gathering places and social centers. English folk songs served similar functions for rural migrants trying to maintain connections to their origins. Political songs and hymns marked the locations of reform meetings and religious gatherings. This musical geography overlay the physical city with networks of cultural identity and social belonging. The penny bloods, cheap, sensational literature sold on street corners fed an appetite for stories that reflected the mysterious nature of fog-wrapped London. Tales of hidden passages, secret societies, mysterious disappearances, and dramatic rescues flourished in a city where visibility was always limited and anything might be lurking just beyond the reach of lamplight. These stories became a form of collective dreaming, a way of imagining agency and adventure within circumstances that often offered little of either. The popularity of sensational literature in the slums reflected more than simple escapism. These stories provided vocabularies for understanding experiences that conventional literature ignored or misrepresented. The themes of hidden identity, sudden reversals of fortune, and the revelation of secret connections spoke to people whose own lives were characterized by uncertainty and invisibility. The fog-wrapped settings of many penny bloods mirrored the actual environment in which readers lived, while the dramatic plot twists offered hope that their own circumstances might be suddenly and dramatically transformed. The literary marketplace that developed around penny publications created opportunities for working-class writers and publishers who understood their audience in ways that more established literary enterprises did not. Stories were often written by people who had direct experience of the conditions they described, giving their narratives an authenticity that more genteel literature lacked. The serial format of many penny bloods also created communities of readers who gathered to hear new installments read aloud, turning reading into a social activity that reinforced neighborhood bonds. Even today, when London's famous fog has been largely eliminated by clean air legislation, something of its mystery persists. On those rare mornings when mist still rises from the Thames, when the modern city briefly returns to its gray-wrapped past, there's a sense of connection to those who once navigated these streets by touch and instinct. The fog becomes a bridge across time, a reminder that the visible world is only one layer of reality, and that beneath the surface of what we can see clearly, other worlds persist, waiting to be discovered. The occasional return of fog to modern London creates moments of temporal dislocation that connect contemporary residents to their Victorian predecessors. The familiar city becomes suddenly mysterious, forcing reliance on senses and navigation techniques that have been dormant for generations. These experiences provide brief glimpses into the daily reality of life in the perpetually fog-wrapped city of the 19th century. Modern fog also serves as a reminder of how dramatically urban environments can be transformed by atmospheric conditions. The London that exists on clear days, with its visible landmarks, readable street signs, and predictable navigation routes, is only one version of the city. Fog reveals the contingent nature of urban familiarity, the way our sense of place depends on conditions that we normally take for granted. As we drift through these memories, surrounded by the ghostly presence of London's perpetual fog, we find ourselves part of an ongoing mystery. Each archaeological discovery, each recovered voice, each preserved object adds another piece to a puzzle that can never be completely solved. The fog keeps its secrets even as it reveals them, reminding us that some aspects of human experience resist simple documentation, persisting instead in the realm of atmosphere, suggestion, and dream. The persistence of mystery in our understanding of Victorian London reflects broader questions about how we know and remember the past. The fog becomes a metaphor for all the aspects of historical experience that escape documentation: the smells and sounds, the textures and temperatures, the emotional climates that shaped daily life but left no permanent trace. Archaeological evidence and written records provide frameworks for understanding, but the lived experience of fog-wrapped London remains partly beyond our reach, existing in the space between what we can document and what we can imagine. As our evening journey through Victorian London's shadows draws toward its close, let us lift our gaze from the narrow alleys and cross an invisible but impermeable boundary. It's just a few streets away from the lodging houses and gin palaces, separated by distance that could be measured in yards but felt like worlds. Another London existed in the same fog, under the same gray sky, but wrapped in circumstances so different they might as well have been on different planets. Picture yourself stepping from the cramped tenement into a hansom cab, its leather seats soft beneath you, its brass fittings gleaming even in the muted light of the fog-wrapped streets, as the horse's hooves click steadily against the cobblestones. You pass through an invisible membrane that separates want from abundance, struggle from ease, uncertainty from the profound comfort of knowing that tomorrow's needs are already provided for. The transition is marked not by any dramatic change in architecture. Indeed, the fog makes visual landmarks largely irrelevant, but by subtle shifts that accumulate into a completely transformed environment. The very quality of the air seems to change as the cab moves away from the overcrowded slums. The acrid smoke from cheap coal, gives way to the cleaner emissions from better-grade fuel. The organic smells of too many people living in too little space fade, replaced by the more refined scents of well-tended gardens, quality soap, and expensive tobacco. The streets themselves tell the story of this transition, where the slum roads were narrow, crooked affairs that had evolved organically over centuries. These broader avenues show the hand of deliberate planning. Cobblestones are more regularly laid, better maintained, less likely to collect the standing water that creates treacherous conditions for pedestrians. Even in the fog, the superior drainage is evident in the absence of the muddy pools and stagnant puddles that characterize the poorer neighborhoods. The first difference you notice is the light, where the slums existed in perpetual twilight. Broken only by the occasional flicker of candle or oil lamp, the fashionable districts bloom with gaslight. Street lamps stand like sentinels along wide boulevards, their steady flames pushing back the fog to create pools of warm illumination. The gas lamps that line these streets burn with the confidence of unlimited fuel, their light spilling generously onto pavements swept clean of the refuse that carpets the narrow lanes you've just left behind. The gaslight infrastructure that served London's wealthy neighborhoods presented a massive investment in urban technology that was largely denied to the poor. The gas mains that supplied these lamps were substantial installations that required significant capital investment and ongoing maintenance. The decision about which neighborhoods received gas service and which did not reflected and reinforced existing social hierarchies, creating literal bright lines between areas of privilege and areas of neglect. The quality of gaslight itself varied significantly across different parts of the city. In wealthy areas, the gas was refined to burn more cleanly and brightly, producing a warm, steady light that could effectively penetrate even thick fog. The lamps were regularly maintained, their glass cleaned, and their mechanisms adjusted to ensure optimal performance. In contrast, the few gas lamps that served poorer areas often burned with a dimmer, more irregular flame, using lower-grade gas and receiving minimal maintenance. The psychological effect of this differential lighting cannot be overstated. Light represents safety, visibility, and control over one's environment. The wealthy district's superior illumination created spaces where people could move with confidence even in the thickest fog, while the poorly lit slums remained dangerous and disorienting under the same conditions. This lighting divide reinforced social divisions by making the wealthy areas more navigable and therefore more appealing to those who could afford to choose where they lived. The houses themselves seemed to breathe differently in this gaslit world, where slum dwellings pressed against each other like frightened animals seeking warmth. These grand residences stand apart in dignified isolation, their windows glowing with the warm light of multiple fireplaces, their chimneys releasing streams of smoke that speak not of desperate attempts to ward off cold, but of rooms heated for comfort rather than mere survival. The architectural language of wealth expressed itself in countless details that marked the boundary between comfort and want. The houses in fashionable districts were designed around assumptions of abundant space, unlimited fuel, and armies of servants to maintain complex systems of comfort. Multiple fireplaces in every room meant that heating was not a matter of gathering around a single source of warmth, but of maintaining consistent temperature throughout large spaces. High ceilings and tall windows reflected confidence that fuel would always be available to heat these generous volumes of air. The construction materials themselves told stories of economic privilege, where slum buildings were thrown together with whatever materials could be obtained cheaply. These grand houses used stone and brick selected for beauty as well as function. The woodwork showed the attention of skilled craftsmen who could afford to take time with details that would be invisible to casual observers. Even utilitarian elements like drain pipes and gutters were made from materials, copper, wrought iron, that were chosen for their durability and appearance rather than their cost. Through those lit windows, if you were to pause and peer inside, you would glimpse scenes that feel almost theatrical in their abundance. Drawing rooms furnished with horsehair sofas and mahogany tables, their surfaces reflecting the light of crystal chandeliers. Dining rooms were tables stretched beneath the weight of white linen, silver serving pieces, and porcelain so delicate it seems to glow with its own inner light. Libraries lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, their gold lettering catching the firelight, promising hours of leisure reading that assumes both literacy and the luxury of time. The interior spaces of wealthy Victorian homes were designed as stages for the performance of social status. Every object, every arrangement, every decorative choice communicated messages about the family's position in society, their cultural sophistication, and their economic resources. The drawing room served as a carefully curated display of taste and wealth, where visitors could immediately assess the family's social standing through the quality of furnishings, the rarity of decorative objects, and the evidence of travel and education visible in art and books. The dining room represented perhaps the most elaborate theater of wealth. The massive tables that dominated these spaces were designed to accommodate dinner parties that might include dozens of guests. With place settings that could involve multiple plates, glasses, and pieces of silverware for each person, the ceremonial aspects of dining in these households required extensive knowledge of social protocols. From the proper use of different utensils to the complex rules governing conversation and behavior, these dinners served not just nutritional needs, but social and economic functions, creating and maintaining the networks of obligation and alliance that sustained upper-class power. The very air in these neighborhoods carries different scents, instead of the mixed aromas of unwashed bodies, coal smoke, and boiled cabbage. Here the fog carries hints of beeswax from polished furniture, lavender from sachets tucked into linen closets, and the rich smell of roasting meat from kitchens where cooks prepare meals that would represent a week's wages for those we left behind in the slums. The olfactory landscape of wealth reflected the elaborate systems of cleanliness and comfort that characterized upper-class domestic life. The beeswax that polished the wooden surfaces of furniture and floors was imported at considerable expense, chosen not just for its protective qualities, but for the subtle, pleasant fragrance it left behind. The lavender and other herbs used to scent clothing and linens represented luxury purchases that served no practical purpose beyond creating an environment of refined sensuality. The cooking smells that emerged from wealthy kitchens told stories of abundance that extended far beyond simple nutrition. The rich aromas of roasting meat spoke of meals that included multiple courses, expensive cuts of meat, and elaborate preparations that required skilled cooks and extensive kitchen facilities. These kitchens were supplied with ingredients from around the world: spices from India, wines from France, tropical fruits from the Caribbean, creating meals that represented a global network of trade and privilege. The people who inhabit this world move with a different rhythm entirely. Where slum dwellers hurried with the urgent efficiency of those who cannot afford to waste a moment, the wealthy stroll with the leisurely gait of those for whom time is not a precious commodity, but an endless resource. Their clothing speaks of this leisure: elaborate dresses that require assistance to darn and remove, tailored coats that would be ruined by any actual labor, accessories that serve no purpose beyond display. The clothing worn by the wealthy represented not just protection from the elements, but a complex system of social communication. Every fabric choice, every cut and decoration, every accessory carried messages about the wearer's social position, economic resources, and cultural sophistication. The elaborate dresses worn by upper-class women required not just expensive materials, but the services of skilled dressmakers who could execute complex designs and the assistance of maids who could help with the intricate fastenings and adjustments these garments required. Men's clothing in wealthy circles followed equally complex rules of propriety and display. The tailored coats that marked gentlemen of leisure were cut from fabrics that would be destroyed by manual labor, constructed with attention to detail that assumed the wearer would never need to concern himself with practical durability. The accessories, walking sticks, pocket watches, jewelry, served no practical purpose, but displayed wealth and taste through their quality and appropriateness to different social occasions. The very pace of movement through the city reflected these different relationships to time and space. Wealthy pedestrians could afford to move slowly because they were not racing against deadlines of hunger or homelessness. Their leisurely gait was itself a form of conspicuous consumption, a display of the luxury of unhurried time. This pace also reflected confidence in their safety and welcome in the spaces they occupied, a security that was denied to those whose presence in certain areas might be questioned or challenged. A typical evening in one of these grand houses unfolds like a carefully orchestrated performance. The master of the house returns from his business, perhaps banking, perhaps investment in the very factories where the children from the slums labor through their shortened childhoods. He enters a world of domestic comfort, so complete it requires the invisible labor of dozens of servants to maintain. His coat is taken by hands he barely notices, his dinner prepared by people who remain as invisible to him as the machinery that produces his wealth. The domestic economy that sustained upper-class comfort depended on vast networks of largely invisible labor. The smooth operation of a wealthy household required not just the obvious servants, butlers, cooks, maids, but armies of specialized workers, whose contributions remained hidden from the family they served. Laundresses who worked in basement washhouses, grooms who maintained the horses and carriages, gardeners who kept the grounds, tradespeople who delivered and maintained the countless material goods that sustained comfortable living. The business activities that generated the wealth to support these elaborate households often had direct connections to the very poverty we observed in the slums. Industrial investments, factory ownership, and trading enterprises created the capital that funded upper-class comfort, while simultaneously creating the working conditions that made slum life necessary for those who labored in these enterprises. The gentleman returning home from his day of business might have spent his time managing investments in textile mills where children worked 16-hour days, or overseeing shipping enterprises that depended on dock workers laboring under dangerous conditions for subsistence wages. The invisibility of this labor to those who benefited from it was not accidental but carefully maintained. Through architectural and social arrangements that kept the mechanisms of wealth production hidden from its beneficiaries, the elegant drawing rooms and dining rooms where the wealthy entertained were designed to reveal no trace of the work that made them possible. Creating spaces where comfort appeared to exist naturally rather than as the product of complex systems of exploitation and extraction, the lady of the house occupies herself with pursuits that assume both education and abundant leisure. She might spend the afternoon arranging flowers in crystal vases, each bloom costing more than a slum family's weekly food budget. She might sit at a grand piano, playing melodies that drift through rooms designed for beauty rather than utility, her music floating out into the fog where it mingles with the distant sounds of struggle from the world beyond her garden walls. The leisure activities of wealthy women represented a complex form of social and cultural work that was both meaningful and constrained. The flower arranging that occupied many afternoons involved sophisticated knowledge of horticulture, color theory, and aesthetic principles. But this expertise was applied within strict limits that prevented it from becoming anything resembling professional or commercial activity. The musical accomplishments that were expected of upper-class women required years of expensive instruction and practice. But performances were limited to private entertainments that reinforced rather than challenged existing social arrangements. These activities served important functions within the social economy of wealth. The beautiful rooms that wealthy women created and maintained served as stages for the entertainment and business activities that sustained family fortunes. The cultural accomplishments they developed, musical performance, linguistic skills, knowledge of literature and art, created forms of social capital that could be deployed in the complex negotiations that governed upper-class marriage, business relationships, and political alliances. Their children inhabit a universe designed around their comfort and development. Nurseries staffed by attentive nannies, schoolrooms where private tutors provide education tailored to their individual needs, playrooms filled with toys that represent more wealth than most families will see in their lifetimes. These children learn languages and literature, mathematics and music, growing into their inheritance of comfort as naturally as breathing. The educational arrangements that shaped wealthy children reflected and reinforced the class divisions that characterized Victorian society. Private tutors provided personalized instruction that could adapt to individual learning styles and interests, while also ensuring that children absorbed the cultural knowledge and social skills necessary for their future roles as inheritors of privilege. The languages they learned, French, German, Italian, Latin, prepared them for international travel and cultural sophistication, while also marking their education as fundamentally different from the basic literacy that might be available to working-class children. The toys that filled wealthy children's playrooms represented not just entertainment, but preparation for their future social roles. Elaborate dollhouses taught girls about domestic management and social hierarchy, while boys played with toy soldiers and mechanical devices that prepared them for roles in military or industrial leadership. The sheer abundance of these toys, often individually crafted by skilled artisans, demonstrated the family's economic resources, while also creating experiences of abundance and choice that would shape children's expectations for their adult lives. But even within this world of abundance, the fog brings its own forms of anxiety. The wealthy feared the diseases that might travel through the gray air from the overcrowded districts nearby. They install elaborate ventilation systems, burn expensive incense, and dose themselves with patent medicines that promise protection from the contagions of poverty. Their comfort exists, they know, alongside but not immune from the suffering that surrounds them. The health concerns that occupied wealthy households reflected the porousness of the boundaries they tried to maintain between themselves and the poverty that surrounded them. Diseases like cholera and tuberculosis showed no respect for class divisions. Traveling through the fog-wrapped city, with democratic indifference to social status, the elaborate precautions that wealthy families took, the ventilation systems, the patent medicines, expensive medical consultations, represented attempts to create immunity through consumption. To purchase safety from the conditions that made disease endemic in the slums, the patent medicine industry that flourished during this period reflected both the genuine health threats that worried the wealthy and the commercial opportunities created by their anxiety. Expensive tonics and treatments promised to strengthen the constitution against urban dangers, while elaborate water filtration and air purification systems offered mechanical solutions to environmental threats. These measures provided psychological comfort even when their actual effectiveness was questionable, creating the illusion that wealth could provide complete protection from the consequences of urban inequality. The charity work that occupies many wealthy women represents one form of bridge across this divide, though it often maintains the distance even as it attempts to span it. Ladies of means organize committees to provide soup kitchens and clothing drives, visiting the slums in carefully planned excursions that allow them to witness suffering without really experiencing it. They return to their drawing rooms with stories of the noble poor and the undeserving poor, creating categories that help them make sense of a world where their abundance exists alongside such desperate want. The charitable activities that absorbed much of wealthy women's time served multiple functions that extended beyond simple philanthropy. These activities provided acceptable outlets for the organizational and leadership skills that women were developing but were prohibited from using. In commercial or political spheres, the committees that managed charitable enterprises created networks of social connection and influence that paralleled, but remained separate from the business and political networks that occupied men. The categories of deserving and undeserving poor that emerged from charitable work reflected the need to maintain moral frameworks that could justify continued inequality. By distinguishing between those whose poverty was seen as the result of unavoidable misfortune and those whose suffering was attributed to moral failings, charitable organizations could provide limited assistance while preserving the larger systems that created poverty. These distinctions allowed wealthy donors to feel virtuous about their limited giving, while avoiding deeper questions about the structural causes of the conditions. These charitable ventures often take on the quality of theater, the poor playing assigned roles as grateful recipients, and the wealthy playing the part of benevolent benefactors. The real complexities of poverty, the way it grinds down human dignity, the impossible choices it forces, the creativity and resilience it demands, remain largely invisible behind the performance of charity that allows both sides to maintain their assigned positions in the social order. The theatrical nature of Victorian charity reflected the broader performance aspects of class relations during this period. The elaborate rituals that surrounded charitable giving, the formal presentations, the ceremonies of gratitude, the published accounts of good works, created public spectacles that reinforced social hierarchies while appearing to address their consequences. These performances allowed the wealthy to demonstrate their virtue and benevolence, while ensuring that the fundamental relationships of power and privilege remained unchanged. The limited scope and conditional nature of charitable assistance reflected the careful calculations that governed upper-class philanthropy. Aid was provided in forms that would not disrupt labor markets or challenge existing economic arrangements. Soup kitchens fed the hungry, but did not provide the regular income that might allow people to escape poverty permanently. Clothing drives addressed immediate needs, but did not tackle the economic conditions that made such assistance necessary. These limitations were not accidental, but reflected deliberate choices about how much change wealthy donors were willing to support. The fog that shrouds both worlds becomes a metaphor for the willful blindness that allows such stark inequality to coexist. In the gray twilight, it becomes possible for the wealthy to imagine that the suffering around them is somehow natural, inevitable, even necessary for the proper functioning of society. The fog obscures the connections between their comfort and others' misery, allowing them to enjoy their advantages without confronting the systems that make such advantages possible. The metaphorical fog that obscured social relationships was as thick and impermeable as the physical fog that wrapped the city. The complex economic and social systems that connected wealth and poverty, the industrial enterprises that generated profits through low wages, the housing markets that concentrated the poor in overcrowded slums, the political arrangements that prioritized property rights over human welfare remained largely invisible to those who benefited from them. This invisibility was actively maintained through educational, cultural, and social practices that encouraged the wealthy to see their advantages as natural and deserved, rather than as products of specific historical and economic arrangements. The psychological mechanisms that allowed comfortable people to coexist with nearby suffering involved sophisticated forms of rationalization and denial. Economic theories that portrayed poverty as the natural result of character defects or market forces provided. Intellectual frameworks for avoiding responsibility for conditions that were actually produced by policy choices and institutional arrangements. Religious and moral philosophies that emphasized individual responsibility rather than social structure offered additional justifications for accepting inequality as inevitable or even beneficial. Yet sometimes the fog betrays these comfortable assumptions. A wealthy gentleman, lost in the gray maze of streets, might find himself suddenly in an alley where children beg for coins to buy bread. A lady, taking a wrong turn in her carriage, might glimpse through the mist a scene of such poverty that it haunts her dreams for weeks afterward. The fog's democratic blindness occasionally forces encounters that the normal geography of class would prevent. These accidental encounters across class lines created moments of potential recognition that threatened the comfortable assumptions that justified inequality. When fog forced wealthy individuals into direct contact with poverty, the abstract theories that explained away suffering confronted the concrete reality of human need and desperation. These experiences could produce genuine transformation in individual consciousness, leading to increased charitable activity or even more fundamental questioning of social arrangements. The responses to such encounters varied widely among different individuals. Some wealthy people used these experiences to reinforce existing prejudices, interpreting what they saw as confirmation of poor people's moral failings or lack of initiative. Others found their comfortable assumptions challenged in ways that led to genuine engagement with social reform movements. A few experienced what might be called conversion experiences, radical transformations of understanding that led them to dedicate their lives to addressing the conditions they had witnessed. The servants who maintain these grand houses represent another kind of bridge between worlds. They move daily between the comfort they create for their employers and the modest rooms where they themselves sleep, often in the very buildings they help to maintain. They know intimately the textures of wealth, the feel of silk and crystal, the weight of silver serving pieces, the particular way gaslight reflects off polished mahogany, but they know it as workers rather than owners, their hands creating beauty they will never possess. The domestic servants who maintained wealthy households occupied a unique position in the social geography of Victorian London. Their work required them to develop intimate knowledge of upper-class life, while remaining excluded from its benefits. They learned to handle expensive objects with care and skill, to understand the complex social protocols that governed upper-class behavior, to anticipate the needs and preferences of their employers. This knowledge created a form of cultural capital that was simultaneously valuable and worthless. Valuable for performing their work effectively, worthless for improving their own social or economic position. The physical proximity of servants to wealth created its own forms of psychological tension. They slept in the same buildings where they polished silver, worth more than they would earn in a lifetime, prepared meals they would never taste, and maintained rooms they would never inhabit as guests. This proximity offered detailed knowledge of how the wealthy lived, while emphasizing the impossibility of servants ever achieving similar circumstances for themselves. These invisible armies of domestic workers carry stories between worlds. They know which wealthy families argue behind their closed doors, which marriages exist more in public performance than private affection, which fortunes rest on shakier foundations than their public display suggests. They also carry news from their own neighborhoods. Stories of friends and families struggling in circumstances their employers can barely imagine. The information networks that domestic servants created and maintained represented one of the few channels of communication that crossed class boundaries in Victorian London. Servants brought news from the working-class neighborhoods where they lived to the wealthy households where they worked, while also carrying information in the opposite direction. These networks could transmit everything from gossip about family scandals to more serious intelligence about business dealings, political activities, and social relationships. The stories that servants carried between worlds often revealed the contradictions and hypocrisies that characterize upper-class life. Families that presented themselves as models of moral virtue might be revealed as torn by internal conflicts, financial difficulties, or personal failures that contradicted their public image. Business leaders who proclaimed their concern for social welfare might be exposed as treating their own employees with casual cruelty. Political figures who advocated for traditional values might be shown living lives that violated their own stated principles. As the evening progresses in this world of comfort, the rituals of wealth unfold with the predictability of ceremony. Elaborate dinners served on plates that are themselves worth small fortunes. Conversations that range over topics of politics and literature, art and travel. Discussions that assume education, leisure, and the luxury of concerning oneself with questions beyond immediate survival. After-dinner entertainment that might include professional musicians performing in private drawing rooms, their art transforming these spaces into small concert halls. The dinner parties that anchored upper-class social life represented complex negotiations of power, influence, and cultural capital. The guest lists for these events reflected careful calculations about social relationships, business opportunities, and political alliances. The conversations that occurred around these dinner tables could influence financial markets, political decisions, and cultural trends, making these private gatherings important sites of public power. The entertainment that concluded these evenings served functions that extended beyond simple pleasure. Musical performances, poetry readings, and other cultural activities demonstrated the family's sophistication and provided opportunities for guests to display their own cultural knowledge and refinement. These events also created shared experiences that strengthened social bonds and reinforced the cultural values that justified and sustained upper-class privilege. The very relationship with time differs in this world. Where the poor measure their days in the struggle to meet immediate needs, the wealthy have the luxury of thinking in longer terms, investments that will mature over years, properties that will appreciate over decades, legacies that will benefit children and grandchildren not yet born. This temporal expansion allows for planning, for accumulation, for the creation of security that stretches beyond the present moment into a guaranteed future. The different temporal orientations that characterize different social classes reflected and reinforced their different economic positions. Wealthy families could make decisions based on long-term considerations because their immediate needs were already secure. They could invest in education that would pay off over decades, purchase properties that would appreciate over generations, and create trusts and endowments that would benefit descendants not yet born. This ability to think and plan in extended time horizons created compound advantages that made wealth self-perpetuating across generations. The investment strategies available to wealthy families during this period created multiple streams of income that could sustain comfortable living without requiring active labor. Government bonds, railway shares, industrial investments, and foreign enterprises offered opportunities for capital growth that were completely unavailable to those struggling with daily survival. The legal mechanisms that protected these investments, complex trust arrangements, inheritance laws, corporate structures created additional barriers that prevented wealth from dispersing back into the broader population. The educational investments that wealthy families made in their children represented perhaps the most important form of long-term planning. Private tutors, elite schools, university education, grand tours of Europe created forms of cultural and social capital that would benefit these children throughout their lives. This education was not just about acquiring knowledge, but about developing the social connections, cultural sophistication, and confidence that would allow them to maintain and expand their inherited advantages. But perhaps the most profound difference lies in the relationship with choice itself, where poverty eliminates options, leaving people with narrow paths defined by necessity. Wealth multiplies possibilities almost infinitely. A wealthy family can choose where to live, what to eat, how to spend their time, whom to associate with, what risks to take or avoid. This abundance of choice becomes so natural that it becomes invisible, as unconscious as breathing. The multiplication of choices that wealth provides creates psychological and social experiences that are almost impossible for those without resources to imagine. When basic needs are guaranteed, attention can turn to preferences, tastes, and desires that have no meaning for those focused on survival. The wealthy could choose not just what to eat, but when, where, and with whom to dine. They could select not just shelter, but homes that reflected their taste, status, and lifestyle preferences. They could decide not just how to spend their time, but how to create meaning and purpose in lives unconstrained by economic necessity. This abundance of choice also created its own forms of anxiety and responsibility. With unlimited options came the burden of decision-making about matters that had no clear guidelines or precedents. Wealthy individuals had to create their own structures of meaning and purpose in lives that offered few external constraints. Some found this freedom liberating, using their resources to pursue knowledge, art, or social reform. Others found it overwhelming, struggling with questions of purpose and meaning that were rarely faced by those whose choices were limited by necessity. The social consequences of unlimited choice extended beyond individual psychology to affect relationships and community connections. When every aspect of life becomes a matter of choice rather than necessity, the bonds that hold communities together can become more fragile. Wealthy individuals could choose their associates based on preference rather than proximity, their activities based on interest rather than obligation, their commitments based on inclination rather than mutual dependence. This freedom could lead to richer, more fulfilling relationships. But it could also create isolation and superficiality that were unknown to those whose survival depended on maintaining strong community bonds. The political implications of unlimited choice were equally significant. Wealthy individuals could choose which laws to support, which candidates to back, which causes to champion, based on their personal convictions rather than their immediate material interests. This freedom gave them disproportionate influence over public policy, while also potentially disconnecting them from the consequences of their political choices. Their decisions about taxation, labor law, and social welfare affected millions of people whose choices were much more constrained. As we complete our journey across this divide, settling back into the fog that wraps both worlds in its gray embrace, we're left with the strange intimacy of distance. These two Londons, existing side by side yet largely invisible to each other, share the same air, the same weather, the same basic human needs for shelter and sustenance and connection. The fog that touches both worlds equally serves as a reminder that beneath the vast differences in circumstance, the same humanity persists, vulnerable to cold, sustained by warmth, seeking comfort and meaning in whatever forms are available. The shared physical environment that encompassed both wealth and poverty created ironies and contradictions that the fog occasionally revealed. The same Thames that provided recreational boating for the wealthy served as workplace and scavenging ground for the poor. The same streets that carried elegant carriages also bore the weight of working people walking to factories and markets. The same buildings often housed both servants and masters, creating vertical hierarchies that placed extreme wealth and desperate poverty within the same architectural structures. The fog that enveloped both worlds equally seemed to mock the elaborate social distinctions that divided them. In the gray twilight, expensive clothes became indistinguishable from cheap ones. Elegant carriages moved no more easily than humble pedestrians, and the confident navigation that wealth usually provided became as uncertain as the fumbling progress of those unfamiliar with urban geography. These moments of equality imposed by atmospheric conditions offered glimpses of the arbitrariness of the social arrangements that normally seemed as permanent and immutable as the city's foundations. The human needs that persisted across class boundaries, for warmth, for companionship, for meaning and purpose. created unexpected parallels between lives that seemed to have nothing in common. The wealthy seeking entertainment in their drawing rooms, and the poor gathering around fires in lodging houses were responding to the same. It's a basic need for social connection and shared experience. The elaborate meals served in grand dining rooms, and the simple bread shared in slum kitchens. Both represented attempts to create ceremony and meaning around the basic act of nourishment. Yet the fog also emphasized the cruel irony of proximity without connection. The physical closeness of wealth and poverty, houses separated by streets, neighborhoods divided by invisible boundaries. Lives lived within sight of each other yet worlds apart, highlighted the social and economic systems that made such stark contrasts possible. The fog that democratically obscured both mansions and tenements served as a metaphor for the ideological blindness that allowed such inequality to persist without generating overwhelming moral outrage. The persistence of these divisions, despite their obvious arbitrariness and cruelty, revealed something profound about human capacity for both empathy and denial. The same fog that could force temporary recognition of shared humanity also provided cover for the willful ignorance that allowed comfortable people to avoid. Confronting the consequences of the systems that sustained their privilege, the gray atmosphere that wrapped the city became both a bridge and a barrier, creating possibilities for connection while also obscuring the relationships that made such dramatic inequality possible. The evening's journey across London's Great Divide leaves us with questions that extend far beyond the particular circumstances of Victorian England. How do societies create and maintain such stark inequalities while preserving the illusion of shared humanity and common purpose? What psychological and social mechanisms allow people to live in close proximity to suffering while maintaining their sense of moral righteousness? How do the physical and social architectures of cities reinforce patterns of privilege and deprivation that seem to contradict basic principles of justice and fairness? The fog-wrapped London of the 1870s offers a particularly clear example of these broader human dilemmas because the physical environment made the contradictions temporarily visible. In the gray twilight that enveloped both wealth and poverty, the careful social constructions that normally kept different classes invisible to each other occasionally broke down, revealing the arbitrary nature of the boundaries that seemed so natural and permanent in clearer light. As our journey concludes, the fog begins to lift slightly, revealing glimpses of the separate worlds we have visited before they retreat, again into their customary invisibility. The grand houses return to their gaslit isolation, their windows glowing with warm light that speaks of comfort and security. The narrow alleys fade back into darkness, their inhabitants resuming their struggles in the gray spaces between official recognition and complete abandonment. The divide reasserts itself as the natural order of things. The temporary equality imposed by fog giving way to the restored hierarchy of normal visibility. But something persists from our evening's exploration. Sense of the connections that exist beneath the surface divisions, an awareness of the shared humanity that no amount of social construction can completely obscure. The fog may lift, but the questions it revealed remain. What obligations do we have to those whose struggles we prefer not to see? How do we live with the knowledge that our comfort may depend on others' suffering? What would it mean to build cities and societies that honor the dignity of all their inhabitants rather than privileging the few at the expense of the many? The voices that echoed through the fog-wrapped streets of Victorian London continued to speak across the years, reminding us that the choice between seeing and not seeing, between acknowledging and denying, between acting and turning away, remains as urgent today as it was in that gray world of more than a century ago. The fog lifts, but the human questions it revealed persist, waiting for answers that each generation must discover for itself. As our quiet journey through the fog-wrapped streets of Victorian London draws to its close, we find ourselves changed by the passage through time, by the voices we've heard echoing across more than a century, by the understanding that comes from walking, even briefly, in shoes worn thin by the daily struggle for survival. The fog that surrounded us throughout this evening has become more than weather, more than atmosphere. It has become a meditation on the veils that separate us from our own history, the gray spaces between what we know and what we can only imagine. In its gentle embrace, we have discovered that the past is not simply a catalog of dates and events, but a living presence that continues to whisper its truths to those willing to listen quietly. The London we have explored tonight, both the narrow alleys where survival was a daily negotiation and the gaslit boulevards where comfort was assumed as naturally as breathing. Reminds us of the profound distance we have traveled from our ancestors' struggles. The simple act of turning on a light, of opening a tap to find clean water flowing, of sleeping in a bed we do not share with strangers, becomes a small miracle when viewed through the lens of what came before. Yet in witnessing these lives lived with such quiet heroism, we have also discovered something timeless about human resilience. In Mrs. Patterson's gentle care for the child sleeping beside her, in Henry Mayhew's patient listening to voices others ignored, in the crossing sweeper's pride in his small earnings, we find echoes of the same hopes and loves and daily courage that sustain us still. The mysteries that remain, the voices lost to the fog, the stories buried beneath the cobblestones, the dreams that found no chronicler, remind us that history is always incomplete, always reaching toward us through the gray distance of time, always inviting us to imagine what we cannot know for certain. In this incompleteness lies not loss, but invitation. The invitation to remember, to honor, to carry forward the quiet heroism of ordinary people living extraordinary lives of endurance. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep in your warm bed, surrounded by comforts that would have seemed miraculous to those we have visited, you carry with you their whispered truths, that survival itself is a form of victory, that small kindnesses echo across centuries, that the fog eventually lifts, revealing not just the struggles it concealed, but the persistent human determination to continue to endure, to find meaning and connection even in the most difficult circumstances. Let the gentle rhythm of their days become the rhythm that carries you into dreams. Let the fog that wrapped their world become the soft gray peace that eases you into rest. And somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, between memory and imagination, perhaps you will hear them still. The voices that refused to be silenced, the hearts that continued beating through the long gray nights. The spirits that remind us that every comfortable present rests upon a foundation of struggles quietly overcome, small victories achieved one breath at a time. The fog lifts, the morning comes. And in the space between then and now, in the gentle continuity of human caring across all the dark and difficult years, we find our rest.